Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today in our reading in Matthew 23, we see Jesus giving a stern rebuke against the scribes and the Pharisees. And he pretty much spends this whole chapter chastising them and bringing out the things that were wrong about them. And in doing so, helps us out because a lot of the things that are brought out in Matthew 23 are things that all religious people are susceptible to. Even people who are very zealous for the Lord might fall into some of these traps. And so it's very important for us to analyze these things and look at them and see if we don't see some of ourselves reflected in these descriptions. And so we'll go through here, and there's some 7 things that these Pharisees were doing and the scribes were doing that Jesus chastised them for. And as we go through there, we want to look within ourselves and see, is there any of these things in our own life? For instance, the first one is that they had double standards. In verse 3, it says, "Therefore, all they tell you to do," after saying they had seated themselves in the chair of Moses, he says, "Therefore, all they tell you to do, observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them." So in other words, they had a standard for other people that they expected other people to follow, but they themselves did not place that standard upon themselves. And so, because of that, they were being rebuked by the Lord. And that's something that us, as people who are following the Lord and those who may be zealous for the Lord, might fall into without even knowing it sometimes. That is, that we might rebuke another person or speak out against another person for doing a particular thing when we, in essence, do the same thing as well. Maybe not in the exact way that they do, but in a way that is similar. And so we have to be very, very careful not to do that. One person might scrutinize another Christian for maybe cheating on his taxes. But then at the same time, the same Christian goes to work and maybe falsifies documents at work. And there's a long list of things that we could give where there's an inconsistency, but it basically boils down to double standards. And whenever we become very highly judgmental of other people, it's almost inevitable that eventually we will fall into this trap of giving out double standards, one way or the other. And so that's one of the dangers of being very judgmental and very critical of other people, and something we should look out for. Another thing about these scribes and Pharisees is that they were all about outward show. In verse 5, it says, "But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments." So they do all their deeds to be noticed by men. They want everyone to see how spiritual, how great they were. And so they would lengthen their phylacteries, as were little writings of scriptures that were attached to their garment. And I guess they thought that, the larger their phylacteries were, the greater their spirituality was. And we can kind of do the same thing as well. We might do outward things just to look good in front of other people, so that other people think that we are spiritual. And it's really just all putting on a show. It's something we need to look out for. This is something we can really be susceptible to when we meet as a church. Put on your best face, put your best foot forward, pretend like you're a real spiritual, devoted person, and then you leave the church building and you go right back into worldliness or other things. Something to look out for. They were also very self-promoting. In verse 6, it says, "They loved the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues." And he goes on in more detail about that, but the main point is that they wanted the places of honor, the places of respect. They wanted to be first in everything. And so they're very self-promoting. And sometimes we can fall susceptible to that as well. Maybe wanting people to look up to us, people to think highly of us because of our spirituality. Or maybe we want people to treat us different than others. Maybe we feel privileged and that we should be treated different than other people because of this or that. We don't need to fall into that trap. Jesus would go on to correct them on this and says in verse 11, "But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted." And that really is the rule of the kingdom. We've seen this all the way through the book of Matthew, as Jesus has taught this time and time again. But they were also a stumbling block to those who really were seeking God. In verse 13 it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." And so this was maybe one of the worst things that they were doing, and that was they were keeping people out of the kingdom life. And they were becoming a stumbling block to other people accepting the message that Jesus had to tell. And maybe sometimes we might become guilty of this as well. Do we ever become stumbling blocks to others? Do we ever maybe make fun of people for being too spiritual? Or maybe look down on people because they're trying too hard. Maybe they put too much restrictions on themselves, we think, and we think they're being foolish. We got to be very careful that we don't become a stumbling block to those who are really seeking and striving to serve the Lord in the best way that they know how. But then we also see the scribes and Pharisees having the improper emphasis on things. And this is somewhat of a lengthy section. We won't read all of it, but we'll get to the crux of it in verse 24, where he says, "You blind guides who strain out at a gnat and swallow a camel." In other words, they would be so concerned about something as small as a gnat, but at the same time they were swallowing a camel. And so you had all these different things. They had the wrong emphasis when it came to swearing. With the altar, with the temple, and the gold of the temple, so on and so forth. They would tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and yet neglect the weightier things of the law, like justice and mercy and faithfulness. And typically a person who is pharisaical, so to speak, someone who is very, very strict, very judgmental, very critical, typically will fall into this trap as well. They'll emphasize very little minute things. They'll get down into the particulars. They'll criticize others for little things here and there, and they'll just take what we call pot shots at people. But all the while, they themselves are forsaking the greater things, like love, compassion, mercy, grace. They're not demonstrating these larger things, but they're so caught up in these details, and all the while they're hurting people, they're injuring people, and they're actually driving people further away from God. And so this is also a very dangerous thing that we can fall victim to, or fall into this trap of. There are also people who were full of inward corruption. Even though they look nice and good on the outside, inside they were very corrupted. We see this in verse 25. It says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence." And then he'd go on also to describe them as whitewashed tombs that look beautiful on the outside, but in the inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So they put on a good show, once again, but on the inside, they were very, very corrupt. And although other people could only see what they displayed on the outside, Jesus could see what was on the inside. And he knew what was on the inside of them. And so it's important for us to understand, and we've talked about this before as we've gone through the book of Matthew, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, And Jesus is mainly concerned with what's on the inside, what's going on in the heart. Even here he says if you clean what's on the inside, the outside will naturally just become clean because the inside is clean. So that's what they should be focusing on, was the inward parts before dealing with the outward parts. And then they become very violent. This is the seventh and last thing that we'll discuss. And this is found in verse 34. It says, "Therefore, behold, I am sending you," he's talking to the Pharisees and scribes here, "I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city." And that was absolutely true. In the first century, one of the main persecutors of the early church was the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders. Even Saul was a part of this as well, who would later become Paul. But they became very, very violent against those who were serving Christ, who were putting their hope in the promises of God. They became very violent. And you can see this with the religious people sometimes as well, especially those who are extremely judgmental and critical. Sometimes they just get downright violent. You can see this sometimes on Facebook posts where you get in these Facebook discussions, and people just tear into other people. They're very unloving, unmerciful, and just violent with their words. They may not ever lay a hand on another person, but emotionally, verbally, they become very, very violent. So it's definitely something that we should avoid. We should never let our zeal for the Lord cause us to be violent towards others. So these are some 7 characteristics of these scribes and Pharisees that we need to avoid. And they're traps that we can very easily fall into even without recognizing it. Having double standards, having a spiritual life that is merely outward show, self-promoting ourselves, becoming a stumbling block to others who are trying to serve God the best they know how, putting the improper emphasis on various things in connection to the scriptures, being full of inward corruption, even though on the outside we try to look good, but inwardly we are corrupted, and just being plain violent with others. So if any of these things describe you or they describe me, we all need to take inventory and see and make sure that this is not the case, and just pray to God that He would reveal it to us if we are falling trapped in these things, and to give us the strength to overcome them so that we can become the type of people that Christ wants us to be. And that is, of course, our ultimate goal. Well, I thank you guys for listening in today. Hope you guys have a great day. I love you guys. God bless.